Bueno, bienvenidos a una nueva conferencia de la Cátedra Libre de Estudios Judíos Moses Mendelssohn de la Universidad de Buenos Aires. Hoy tenemos la alegría intelectual, el honor, el placer de compartir la conferencia del doctor Yaniv Feller titulada Leo Baeck y sus contextos imperiales. El doctor Yaniv Feller es investigador especializado en pensamiento judío moderno y estudios museísticos. Su primer libro, La imaginación imperial judía, Leo Baeck y el pensamiento judeo-alemán, fue editado por Cambridge University Press en 1923 y el libro del doctor Feller ganó el premio Jordan Schnitzer de la Asociación de Estudios Judíos. Además, es codirector de Pensando con el Pacto, ensayos sobre la filosofía y teología de David Novak, editado por la Universidad de Toronto en el 24. Y además es autor de varios papers en revistas especializadas. Entre el 2015 y el 2017, Yaniv trabajó como curador de religión judía en la nueva exposición permanente del Museo Judío de Berlín. Actualmente es profesor en la Florida University. Ahora, University, Florida. Bueno, hay algo muy gracioso sobre ese tema que después vas a comentar. Así que está muy bien. Florida University o al revés, Florida University. Bueno, eh, querido dear Yaniv Feller,
Thank you so much. I hope the translation works well. I will try to speak slowly because of that. It is an honor and a privilege to be talking to all of you today. This is my first talk ever being translated simultaneously to Spanish, so that's very cool. So muchas gracias, Pablo, for the invitation, and Alejandro for all the help. And why don't I share my screen and we can see what I am talking about. So I hope you can all see my screen now. See? So it is really, we really live in the age of the Tower of Babel because the talk is translated into Spanish from English. And I used AI to translate all the slides, the PowerPoint, so you will be able to see it. Hopefully it will all make sense for everybody. The topic of my talk today is Leo Baeck. Some of you might have encountered the name. He is nowadays remembered, indeed revered, as the leader of German Jewry during the Holocaust. In fact, I was told that Baeck is memorialized in the Culto Israelita de Belgrano in Buenos Aires, which people used to talk about as the Leo Baeck Synagogue many decades ago, because it was one of his students that helped build it. So there's just one connection, and we will see more of those. But Beck knew that this type of legacy of name recognition is really meaningless if it is not followed up by thinking, by philosophy. As he himself once said, laurels have no nutritional value. They are meaningless. They might crown a winner, but they have no meaning of their own. They are merely symbols. In other words, we need to understand the person and the thinker rather than the symbol. And this is what we will do today together, starting with his biography and moving beyond it to examine what Beck can teach us about German Jews in the age of empires. So I therefore begin with a brief biographical sketch that stresses the historical, political context in which Beck lived. I then wish to highlight several, in fact 4, aspects of his thought and how they were shaped by empires. First, the question about his debate with Adolf Harnack, the most important Protestant theologian of his generation, about the essence of religion. Second, the idea of Jewish missionizing, which is very controversial nowadays, but wasn't in Beck's time. Third, a distinction he makes, and pardon my German, between Kraft and Macht, or between Macht and Kraft, between power and energy. And finally, of course, the big question of Zionism, which is very relevant for many of us today. But all these questions, I will argue, are connected. So why don't we begin, just by way of brief introduction, with the thinker, or a life amidst empires. Leo Baeck lived as part of a Jewish minority through multiple imperial constellations. And these are reflected, that's the argument of my book, in his thought. He was born in Lissa, in East Prussia, today Leszno, in Poland, in 1873, to a family with a long and very, very distinguished rabbinic lineage. It was only 2 years after what was called the Kaiserreich, or the German Empire, or the United Germany, was founded in 1871. It is only then that Jews received complete and equal political and civil rights. Or at least on paper they did, right? The question of whether or not to grant Jews rights has been highly contested since the late 19th century, or since the late 18th century, actually, in what has been called the Jewish question. And here you have two very different pamphlets with the Jewish question, or the Judenfrage. One is by an anti-Semite, Düring, and the other, the subtitle of Herzl's The Jewish State, is called A Modern Solution to the Jewish Question. So it shows you the spectrum of responses. The decade in the 1880s saw not only the political emancipation of Jews, but also political anti-Semitism that thought to reverse this process of emancipation. And in the first decade, in 1880, more than 500 pamphlets were dedicated in this period to the question of the Jewish question, from Jews and non-Jews alike. Now, what I have observed is that at the same time that the Jewish question was hotly debated, another discussion took place in Germany. This one was the colonial question and the place of Germany in the world as a new world power, what Heinrich von Bülow called Germany's place in the sun. I mention this because contemporary discussions of Jews and empire don't really discuss Germany as a colonial power. Maybe it is because many of the German colonial projects were not really successful and did not last for long. However, at its peak, Germany was one of the leading European powers. It was third in terms of territory and fifth in terms of population. So we need to pause on this. The exact period of the explosion of the Jewish question is a time when German expansion outwards and the establishment of German colonies overseas and in Poland takes place. Both questions, the Jewish question and the colonial question, were means of a German self-definition. They were German questions. So Beck studied at the Jewish Theological Seminary in Breslau, today Wrocław, around this period. But before graduating, he transferred to the more liberal or reform Lehranstalt, later Hochschule für Wissenschaft des Judentums in Berlin. And there he completed his rabbinical training and, as was common at the time, also a doctorate. He was appointed a rabbi in Opeln, today Opole, in Poland, and I'll say a word about the names in a moment, where he would serve as a rabbi for the next decade before settling in Berlin. And you would notice I used both German and Polish names. This is because these cities were at the time German, but were inhabited mostly by a Polish population, and today they are part of Poland. The Germans briefly tried to assimilate, that is to Germanize, the local population before moving to a colonization program of resettling Germans in East Prussia. So there's one scholar, Christine Kopp, that calls it was Germany's Wild East, like the American Wild West. This is where they kind of had their adventures and colonial experiments. Beck is a German patriot. With the start of the First World War, he was one of the first rabbis to volunteer as an army chaplain on behalf of the Jewish community. He serves almost the entire duration of the war, almost 4 years, first on the Western Front and then on the Eastern Front. During the Weimar Republic, he became a public intellectual who not only held position within the Jewish community, but he was also frequently invited to speak to non-Jewish audiences about Judaism. So he gets to meet Counts and Grafs, he gets to meet Gustav Jung, the leading Carl Gustav Jung, the leading psychoanalyst. He gets to meet Ernst Troeltsch, the leading church historian. He's really moving in those public intellectual circles. When the Nazis came to power in 1933, Beck was appointed as the head of the Reich representation of German Jews. This was a Jewish umbrella organization uniting most, but not all, German Jews. And this is where it becomes controversial. He remained in his role even after the 1938 November pogrom, known as Kristallnacht, when the Reich representation became the Reich Association of Jews in Germany, which was a Gestapo-controlled organization. In 1943, Beck was transported to Theresienstadt ghetto. Here we see him with the yellow star. If you ever wondered why it is called The Final Solution, again, the title is The Final Solution to the Jewish Question. So again, we see this idea of the Jewish question. Beck survives Theresienstadt, and after liberation, he moves to London to be with his only daughter, Ruth. His wife, Natalie, passed in the 1930s. He quickly resumed his scholarly and public activities. He became what I call a statesman without a state. He was like a president, but there was no real state behind him. When he visited the United States in 1948, for example, he met President Truman in the White House, as if he does lead a state. He was also invited to open a congressional session with a prayer, and in doing so became the first non-American rabbi to receive this honor. And Beck passed in 1956 in London, where he is buried. Already in his lifetime, Beck was much celebrated. One American army officer called him, I quote, the Pope of German Jews. Never mind that German Jews didn't even have a chief rabbi. When he asked, who is this Leo Baeck, he was told he is the Pope of German Jews. The popular American rabbi Joshua Loth Liebman said he was, I quote, the most memorable person I have ever met and a living saint. So he puts him on the same level as Rabbi Akiva. Alongside all these accolades and praise, there was also critique, and harsh critique sometimes. Hannah Arendt, reporting for the New Yorker on the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem, used a mixture of English and German, and I don't know how it will translate here, when she called Beck the Jewish Führer. So she says Jewish in English, but Führer in German. This was a very harsh statement that the great Kabbalah scholar who knew Arendt, Gershom Scholem, criticized. And that Arendt, interestingly enough, she left the critique of Beck, but she deleted this statement, the Jewish Führer, from subsequent editions of her book, Eichmann in Jerusalem. I suspect she knew, even Arendt knew she went too far. So this is some of the critique, but if named institutions are any measure, then Beck is still held in the highest regard. I mentioned Buenos Aires, but here are some more examples. The Leo Baeck Institute is the central archive of German Jewish history, with branches in New York, Jerusalem, London, and Berlin. The seat of the Central Council of Jews in Germany is in the Leo Baeck House in Berlin. which used to be where he taught for many decades. It used to be the Hochschule. In Haifa and Toronto, there are Jewish day schools that are named after Leo Baeck. And there's also a Leo Baeck synagogue in Los Angeles. In this sense, Baeck is still, as historian Eva Reichman wrote, a symbol of German Jewry. So Baeck is therefore interesting for us for several reasons, I would suggest. First, for his own thought, which tried to understand the Jewish condition through multiple imperial and colonial regimes. He really lived through multiple Germanies, right? Second, as a communal leader, his thought reflects more than an idiosyncratic, highbrow scholar that only other philosophers read. Baeck had to address broader concerns of German Jews. He was a communal leader and a philosopher. Finally, as a representative of this legacy, an understanding of Baeck is an understanding of German Jewish thought. I am happy to talk about all aspects of his life, but for now, as said, enough with the laurels. Let's move on to the philosophy. And we begin the philosophy in his first and major work, The Essence of Judaism. To understand the essence of Judaism and Baeck's thought, we need to understand to whom he reacts, who is the adversary. First and foremost, in his early career, the answer is, as I mentioned, Adolf Harnack or Adolf von Harnack, which was the leading historian of the era. In 1899-1900, Harnack gave a series of lectures in Berlin titled The Essence of Christianity. In them, he tried to distill the essence of Christianity as evident in what he identified as the authentic sayings of Jesus. This was his historical method. In short, it is the belief in the coming kingdom, the value of the human soul, and the commandment of love. You want it even shorter? Christianity is an ethical religion, and especially Protestantism. That's the main argument. Harnack's lectures were published as a book and became an immediate bestseller, being translated to several languages, running many editions. Now, Harnack's position was controversial among Christian scholars. Some thought he has given too much weight to history over dogma. Others complained he did not give enough weight to history. Jewish thinkers had their own issue with the lectures, and I'm not going to read the quotes because they are in Spanish, because I translated them, but you can read them as I talk about them. So Harnack is highlighting the uniqueness of the message of Jesus, but he does it as a light against the dark foil of the Pharisees, and by implication, Christianity against Judaism. So Jewish thinkers and rabbis like Baeck really felt the need to respond. Baeck was then an unknown rabbi, barely 30 years old. He was one of the first to respond. He wrote a long scholarly essay in which he criticized Harnack for not knowing his rabbinical sources, claiming that otherwise Harnack would have recognized that everything he says about Jesus can be said about Jews, meaning Jesus was a Jew. Since the pioneering work of Abraham Geiger in the second half of the 19th century, Jewish thinkers insisted on the Jewishness of Jesus in order to combat anti-Jewish accusations and show the value of Judaism, both historically and for the contemporary moment. So Baeck is in line with this trend, which Susanna Heschel, in her pioneering work on Geiger, called reversing the colonial gaze. And here we have a striking visual representation of this idea. To those of you who identify probably, this is Marc Chagall's famous white crucifixion, in which Jesus is described almost as a victim of the pogrom in the background and is covered with a talit, with a Jewish prayer shawl. In 1905, Baeck publishes The Essence of Judaism. On the one hand, it is clearly a reply to Harnack, right? The essence of Judaism versus the essence of Christianity. Yet it is not a response in the traditional sense of the word. Harnack is barely mentioned and only in the endnotes. Instead, it is a full-fledged presentation of Baeck's understanding of Judaism. So understanding the structure can be helpful in understanding the work. The first part is historical or methodological, we can read it like a question. How does one define the essence? Baeck, like Harnack, finds the essence in the highest expression, in what they call the geniuses of the religion. In the Jewish case, and here is another polemic of Baeck with Christian scholars, it's not just Jesus, it is the prophets of the Hebrew Bible. The central point in this regard is that Judaism for Baeck, like Christianity for Harnack, is an ethical religion. Okay, so ethic composes the essence of Judaism. And is representative here of a long German Jewish tradition that can be called ethical monotheism, namely the claim that one needs the idea of the Jewish God in order to fulfill a vision of morality. Returning to the essence of Judaism, the second part, the ideas of Judaism, is the one that contains Baeck's own presentation, really, which is based on the basic premise of the morality of Judaism. It begins with faith in God, which leads in turn to the foundation of the I, the neighbor, and faith in humanity. This is a conceptual framework rather than a historical one, and like many of Baeck's earlier work, is heavily influenced by the neo-Kantian Jewish philosopher Hermann Cohen. Interestingly enough, when Baeck publishes this book again in 1922, this section, the ideas of Judaism, is almost double in size. He admits it as much, and in the new preface he is calling it an old book and a new book. And I suggest what has changed is the intellectual context in the aftermath of the Great War. World War I was a breaking point for many philosophers, theologians. So to give you a couple of examples, in Protestant theology, the symbol of this new approach is the so-called crisis theology of Karl Barth. In philosophy, one can think of the radical logical positivism of Ludwig Wittgenstein. And in Jewish philosophy, we have the examples of Franz Rosenzweig and Martin Buber, here with Leo Baeck after the Second World War. So Baeck is part of this trend. It is an exaggeration to call Baeck an existentialist thinker, but it definitely shows more attention, both to the encounter with the divine, as well as to the question of the meaning of Jewish existence. Indeed, this question of Jewish existence is a primary concern for Baeck already in the essence, and with growing urgency given the rise of Nazism. For example, in 1935, while still living in Berlin, Baeck lectures on the subject of the existence of the Jew. In this lecture, he both probes the origins of anti-Semitism, while also trying to comfort listeners by saying that Jews have always been surrounded, but that their strength reaches beyond the current constraints of the moment, thanks to their faith in and relation to God. This is also evident in his reply to the so-called dogma debate that was ongoing since the 18th century, and it took a new life in the early 20th century. Again, to make a long story short, since the time of the Enlightenment, and here we see, of course, an imagined meeting that never took place between Moses Mendelssohn, Lavater, and Lessing, who is the one standing. Since the Enlightenment, dogmas came under critical scrutiny because they were seen as limiting the freedom of thought. You have to believe something. So Mendelssohn, for example, insisted that Judaism does not force any thinking, but creates a community and virtuous citizen by following the Jewish law, which is praxis-oriented, or what he called living script. In the early 20th century, and here we have Harnack again, Christian scholars also debated dogma. The entire project of Harnack was to show that dogmas are later historical developments and therefore not part of the true essence of Christianity. He dedicates 7 volumes masterpiece to the subject called The History of Dogma. And early in the essence of Judaism, Baeck takes a stab at Harnack without officially naming him, by insisting that Judaism does not have dogmas because it is based on the aforementioned freedom of thought. Judaism is also undogmatic, Baeck suggested, because unlike Christianity, Judaism does not enforce its position using violence. Okay, so dogma for Beck is tied to either church or state violence. I return to this point when discussing Kraft and Macht, but for now let us examine the implications of Beck's position, which leads me to the part that I was very excited to discover, and I didn't know that many will find it controversial, the Jewish mission to the world. Beck was concerned with the existence of Jews as a minority throughout his entire career. In 1905, he wrote very early in the pages of The Essence of Judaism that, I quote in English, "A minority is compelled to think. It must always persist in the mental struggle for that consciousness of truth which success and power comfortably assure to rulers and their supporting multitudes." So Jews don't have the privilege of being complacent because they are a minority. But this, of course, raises a question which is quite profound for Jews everywhere. Why even be a minority in the world? Why not assimilate? More than 40 years after the essence of Judaism, with 2 world wars and the Holocaust in recent memory, Beck published an article in English in Commentary magazine. Its title is "Why Jews in the World?" The answer: Jews are in the world, to quote, as witnesses, and here every witness becomes a herald, and every herald a pioneer. They are in the world as witnesses, heralds, and pioneers of the one God. In answering the question of the existence of the Jewish minority, Beck emphasized its creativity and ethical value. Why Jews in the world sounds like an odd question, right? It sounds weird. But it's one that obviously Beck felt the need to reply to. And for him, the answer was tied to the ethical mission of Judaism, to this Judaism as ethics that I described earlier. There are 2 ways to understand it, diachronically and synchronically. Diachronically, it was rooted in earlier discourse about the mission of Judaism as a prophetic religion. Synchronically, it was grounded in the German imperial context. They both converge in what can be called the Jewish mission. So let's begin with the Jewish mission to the world historically, which is central for many Jewish self-understanding in modernity, and so it was for Beck. In the Enlightenment, non-Jewish prominent figures, including from left to right, Herder, Schiller, and Lessing, argued that Jews were participating in a universal mission of educating humanity. This claim, which assigns to the Jew a higher role than simply a witness to the triumph of the church, nonetheless still treated Judaism as a stepping stone toward the higher morality of Christianity. It is a good step, but it is a first step. And for Lessing, for example, it's Judaism, Christianity, and then religion of reason. In the 19th century, a variety of Jewish thinkers from all spectrums of denominations, from Reform to Orthodox, adopted this idea of a Jewish mission as part of their integration in non-Jewish society. And I suggest Beck works within this tradition. Jewish existence, Beck wrote 30 years later in Nazi Berlin, is a vulnerable existence. The minority condition is not just one of creativity. It is also one of danger, and we see it, of course, nowadays with rising anti-Semitism. This is, of course, a political statement, but it is also another polemic with Christianity that I want us to notice. The 4th century bishop, Augustine of Hippo, developed a theology that claimed that Jews should be kept alive, but in an inferior status, and in dispersion in the diaspora as witnesses. The lower status of the Jews was to serve as a warning for those who do not believe in Christ, at least until the second coming of Christ, when this tension would be finally solved and everything supposedly would be very peaceful and happy. Now Beck turns Augustine on his head. He turns him upside down. In one point in the essence of Judaism, he writes, and that's the one you have in the quote, "The treatment of Jews will serve as a yardstick to morality. In other words, tell me how the Jews, and minorities more broadly are treated, and I'll tell you how far we are from the Messianic age. There is also another consequence to the Jewish ethical task in the world, that of Jewish missionizing. And Beck argued that Jews should be missionaries, meaning they should try and convert other people. It is their ethical duty to expand morality through promoting the belief in the one God. I developed this point in my book, The Jewish Imperial Imagination, so here I can offer only 2 or 3 quick pieces of evidence. Again, the quotes will be on the screen in Spanish. Uno, one early, one late. First, the essence of Judaism. Beck explains in the essence of Judaism that Judaism tries to convert the world. The German word is Bekehren. If there is any doubt how this is to be translated, he adds a private letter from 1910 that missionizing would improve the perception of Jews among Jews and non-Jews alike. Because Jews would take pride, look, other people want to join, and the same would be for non-Jews. And Beck remains firm in this position throughout his entire life. And here is the second piece of evidence, and the emphasis is mine. After the Holocaust, shortly after the Holocaust, Beck insisted that missionizing is even more urgent than ever. He offers here a vision, of expansion through conversion. He's like, we need more people. We Jews need more people after the Holocaust. We need to expand the message. Let's send missionaries. To understand this idea that Jews are missionaries, which might sound very foreign to many of us, I suggest the imperial context is important. So in the German imperial fantasy of at least between 1870s and 1914, but especially since 1880, there were 2 kinds of fantasies, the racial and the civilizing. At times, the 2 collided, racial theories suggesting that there can be no significant improvement in the state of lesser races. At other times, the 2 worked together, as in the claim that because Germans are more advanced race, again, this is their claim, of course, not mine, it is their moral responsibility to help those less fortunate. The civilizing fantasy, like the racial one, was common to many empires, including the British and the French. In Germany, it took a slightly different path because Germany didn't have colonies until very late. And so they could say, oh, the British, the French are violent. If we had colonies, we would have treated them differently. But of course, as soon as they have colonies, they treat them very badly. So when Germans acquired colonies, this attitude began to change. Friedrich Fabry, which was a prominent advocate of German colonization and the leader of a missionary society, so here you have the connection again, wrote in his manifest, Does Germany Need Colonies? That the people like the German that reach the peak of its power could remain in the peak of its power only if it shows a cultural mission. Without this, Fabry warned, political power would lead to barbarism. Understood this way, there is no necessary contradiction between espousing, and here is Bedarf Deutschlander Kolonien. There is no contradiction between espousing liberal causes in the name of civilizing mission, such as open civil society, the rule of law, scientific and educational development, and support for colonialism, because the 2 can be seen as complementary. Now, let me be clear that I do not equate Beck's vision of missionizing and the German imperial fantasies. There is a sense in which the latter might have inspired the former, as evident in the idea of Jews bringing ethical improvement through conversion of the heathens, right? At the same time, Beck's Jewish missionizing is also a critique of imperial power. Jews, he implies, can be better colonizers because they do not use violence. So to develop this point, let's turn to what I identified in my book as the distinction between Macht and Kraft, between 2 different kinds of missionizing, indeed 2 different kinds of being in the world. Macht would be the power, the imperial, and Kraft would be the Jewish, the spiritual energy. So here is one place where Beck defined the terms, and again, pardon the German. the distinction is between physical, violent power and spiritual energy or strength. And I was very happy to see when I plugged the quote in DeepL, in the AI translator, that it indeed translates Kraft as energia, or energia, which is how I read it also in the English. Jewish missionizing is without the violence of state power or of church power. If you want, it is the spirit, but it is not the sword. And Beck held this position from very early in his career. This is from 1917, 1918. Similar comments are made in The Essence of Judaism in 1905, and he maintains it even in Theresienstadt ghetto. He gave many lectures in the ghetto. Sadly, only one set of texts survived intact. It is titled The Writing of History, or Historiography, from June 1944. In this text, Beck contrasted the Greco-Roman idea of the writing of history with the Jewish prophets. Western historiography is pessimist, he argued, because it sees the collapse and destruction. It sees empires fall. The prophets offer an alternative, an optimist model, and Beck thought Judaism was the religion of optimism per excellence. So here you have one quote that you can read as I talk about it. Empires based on Macht, on physical power, will collapse if left unchecked. Empires that claimed eternity were in fact transient. One empire replaced the other. What remains is only ruins, and in another text he would say not even ruins remain. By contrast, a people committed to justice and the one God will survive. Without justice, history is that of violence. It is anti-historia. With it, it is a constructive enterprise. Kraft, in other words, wins in the long run over Macht. Or if you prefer Martin Luther King Jr.'s version, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. End quote. The Jewish minority preserves itself precisely through its belief in God and a better future. It is a gaze beyond the current moment. Because the current moment is not kind to Jewish existence, which, as said, is vulnerable. We should not lose sight of the imperial and political context in which Beck writes this. To remind you, this is a lecture given in Theresienstadt ghetto. The reference or the allusion would not have been lost on the prisoners. Nazi power, Theresienstadt, would pass away just as others before it failed. The Third Reich, the Nazi empire, the 1,000-year empire proclaimed by Hitler, was guaranteed, Beck tells his listeners, to become sunken ruins. So at a dark time under persecution, Beck used this distinction between Macht and Kraft to offer hope. And with this I come to my last point that I want to share with you today about Beck, namely his views about Zionism. Given this distinction between Macht and Kraft and his views on the Jews and of Jews and ethics, what were his views on Zionism? There are no easy answers. To begin with, let us remember that in the late 19th century, Zionism did not enjoy much success among German Jews, to say the least. In 1904, the time of Theodor Herzl's death, according to Derek Penzler, about 1% of Jews worldwide were members of the Zionist movement, so a tiny fraction. Beck was not a Zionist. Here is an image from, I think, the first or second Zionist congresses. He was not a Zionist, but neither did he oppose the movement. During the Zionist Congress in Basel in 1897, the executive board of the Association of German Rabbis, in a show of unity, condemned the Zionist movement. So they basically did a vote, and if you vote yes, you reject Zionism. Among 97 rabbis, only 3 did not vote yes. And one of them was Leo Baeck, which was at the time a very young rabbi starting his career, so it was definitely a risk to an extent. Over the years, Beck saw more and more value in the Jewish settlement in Palestine. In the mid-1920s, he called for liberal Judaism, what we call today the Reform movement, to play a more active role within the Zionist movement. Again, this is not an obvious position at the time, as the official position was mostly negative, including of Beck's friend Claude Montefiore, who you see here. Montefiore was the president of the World Union of Progressive Judaism, and he saw liberal Judaism and Zionism as antithetical. He was concerned by Beck's pro-Zionist tendencies. I found in the archives a letter in which Montefiore pleads with Beck, I quote, to remain a staunch liberal and do not become too Zionistic or even too semi-Zionistic. We liberals need you, end quote. For Montefiore, the two were clearly in opposition, but not for Beck. Here is some mathematics, but it will become clear in a moment. After the Holocaust, Beck wrote of Jewish history as grounded in a bifocal existence, or as an ellipse, right? So a circle has one center, an ellipse has two. In ancient times, these were the northern and the southern kingdom. Then it was Palestine and Babylonia. Then it was Ashkenaz and Sepharad. In the post-war era, he came to see Palestine and later the State of Israel as one of the two poles of Jewish existence, along with the United States. So Beck never doubted the morality behind the Jewish settlements in Palestine or its value for Jewish life. I suggest he did it for a few reasons. First, it is tied to his idea of the expansion of Judaism, of Jewish missionizing, which again he believed could be done without violence. Naive, I know. Second, there was a common strand in colonial thought, which found, for example, expression in the philosophy of John Locke, that believed the following: people are entitled to a land if they help improve it, and if we want to expand it further, also help the local population. So this is the cultural mission that we saw earlier. Mary Louise Pratt called this anti-conquest. Of course, the native population never asked for any of this supposedly generous help. But Beck is not alone here in being a Jewish thinker thinking about it. In certain moments in his career, such as the utopian novel Alt Neuland, Old New Land, Theodor Herzl, founding father of political Zionism, shared similar sentiments about how Jewish settlements would benefit the Jews, the land, and the local Arab population, and even Europe and the world. Third, there was a pragmatic argument. At times, Beck shared the idea that Jews in Germany need to reform their vocational outlook, that they shouldn't just be what we will call city dwellers, that they should be farmers. One common solution was Jewish regeneration through agrarian labor. Jewish farmers, basically. The Jewish Bodenkulturverein tried to settle Jews in East Prussia, again, kind of a German colony, as potential for this place. But another option for Jewish farming regeneration was Palestine. It is important to realize that the two are not mutually exclusive. Take, for example, Otto Warburg, who was a Zionist and a supporter of German colonialism and of the idea of Jewish settlement in East Prussia. These things were seen as going together for some people, not either or. So you see again how the Jewish and colonial questions were intertwined. Finally, after the rise of Nazism and also in the aftermath of the Holocaust, there was another very pragmatic consideration. Where can Jews be safe in the world? Immigration to Palestine was not necessarily the first option for many Jews, but at this point, when the gates everywhere were closing, they would take what they could, whether Shanghai, the Dominican Republic, or Palestine. Yes, it is easy to find faults in Beck's thought in August 2025. But it is also worth remembering how he imagined Jewish life in Palestine should be. In a 1937 letter, Beck wrote that the only acceptable solution, I quote, is that Jews and Arabs build a united front for the renewed search and beginning of a united Palestine, end quote. Beck hoped the United Nations Resolution 181 for the partition of the land was only a step on a longer path. The ultimate goal, to quote him once more, was, I quote, one state comprising one economic body with two administrations, end quote. Support for the Jews in Palestine does not mean they are immune from critique. On the contrary, in a letter published in the Times, in the New York Times, and co-signed by Albert Einstein and Leo Baeck, they approvingly cite the Jewish group who call for binationalism, such as Brit Shalom and Ichud, which is another proof of his preferred solution. The letter was published on April 18, 1948, less than 3 years after the Holocaust and less than a month before the State of Israel was officially declared. Earlier drafts, based on my research, likely prepared by the German Jewish psychoanalyst Erich Fromm, were even harsher. They decried, and I'll quote, the growing fanaticism of the official Jewish settlements, end quote. The undersigned, again I quote, view with alarm the growing cynicism in their own ranks, which lightheartedly will dismiss any argument or any action that happens not to coincide with the Jewish interests as full-fledged proof of conscious, calculated hostility toward the Jewish people, end quote. The final version that they published in the Times was a bit milder, as you can see, but still remains very critical of Jewish extremists and violence. I often get the question, what would he have said today? I don't know. He died more than 75 years ago. I do know that what his vision at the time was. It was a binational state or some kind of confederation. Already in the 1940s, this was considered a marginal position, and after October 7, it is rarely mentioned. But it is a vision nonetheless, one that some would reject as outdated, unrealistic, and naive. Beck taught that we need more ethical resolve, more spiritual and energy, more craft to oppose power. Otherwise, all that's left are the ruins of empire. For him, Judaism was an ethical religion because it was a religion of optimism. It believed in a better messianic future. Beck kept this faith even after the horrors of the Holocaust he himself experienced. In these dark times, let us remember this too. We could all use a dose of optimism right now, even if it is only an echo from the past. Thank you. And I am happy to take any questions. It is supposed to translate.
Maravilloso, maravilloso, maravilloso.
Bueno, ¿puedo hacer la pregunta en inglés?
Mejor.
También.
Okay, first of all, thank you very much. It was amazing to hear you. I studied the Buber, so for me it was also really enlightening a lot of things. I have two questions. First of all, on this idea of the mission of the Jews and the minority, how is coherent to understand the mission of the Jews through the minority, but then talk about missionating and expand and convert other people and so on and so on. So first question that, and second question, in this idea of being a minority to show how the ethic is not becoming right, because how the majority is treating the minority is showing how ethics are going through. Can we find some of these ideas, for example, in Max Scholek, or I'm thinking especially this Jewish philosopher from Berlin, Max Scholek, that talk about Jews and talk about some of these things of minorities and so on. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yes, if you don't mind writing, Facundo, if you don't mind writing the name of the thinker in the chat, because I don't think I'm familiar with him, so I would love to have a look at it, and I'll answer this question in a more general way. Okay, yeah. So he's a contemporary writer, right? Yeah. Okay. So let's begin with the missionizing. I see what you say. It seems incoherent, right? If we want the Jews to be a minority, then how come it's expansion? Well, they are such a tiny minority that Beck would say, if they spread ethics, sure, if everybody would become ethical, this would be the Messianic era, right? And in fact, he has places where he does what Amos Funkenstein calls a kind of theodicy, in which he says, it's good that Jews are dispersed among the nations, because that way they can be more active in many different places. That's again kind of his ambivalent relation to Zionism, or this bifocal approach. We need centers, but it's good that there are Jews in Spain and in Poland and in the United States and in Buenos Aires and in Florida, right? Because from his perspective, it gives more opportunities to do this ethical work. So in this sense, I think it's not a contradiction, but it sort of complements, because redemption or the Messianic age would come only in the end anyway. And like Herman Cohen, he thinks it's a never-ending process. And yes, it is similar to Rosenzweig. Rosenzweig and Beck knew each other quite well. Franz Rosenzweig, the great German Jewish philosopher, wrote a very critical review of Beck called Apologetic Thinking, in which he accused Beck of making a caricature out of both Christianity and Judaism. And like Rosenzweig, who is very smart, it is a very good critique. In fact, reading this was one of the first things that got me interested in Beck, because like Facundo, I started with Buber. But I actually found a letter that Beck answers Rosenzweig. And he says, oh yeah, I know I made caricature of Christianity. I'm fully aware of that. But it is about time that they see themselves for once in this light. So it's kind of an interesting back and forth that both are very much knowledgeable about what they are doing. Now, the majority treating the minority, yes, it has a lot of echoes, not only in Beck, also as mentioned earlier in Herman Cohen, and later maybe all the way to Max Scholek. And Til van Raden wrote recently a book about kind of tolerance and pluralism, which also works along similar lines. So there's definitely a very long historical trajectory that includes thinking about Jews as a minority. There's also a new book, I don't know if it was published yet, which is called Good Jews by Gerard Daniel Cohen. And it's about philo-Semitism in Europe from 1945 onward, and how this thing can appear positive, but also can take very negative tones, of course. So thank you for your question.
Guillermo, ¿alguna? Silvana. Desde el paraíso.
Yes, thank you very much, Yaniv, for this interesting lecture. I really was interested in this the concept about Kraft and Macht, because of course, yes, he has Leo Baeck has experienced himself what is Macht in Theresienstadt, and exactly with his craft, with his spiritual energy and his spiritual, he empowered. He tried to empower also the inmates and helped many. But now, is there anything after about his thought? How can Kraft? How can the Kraft really combat and be successful against power? This is my question. Thank you.
Thanks, Silvana.
And it's a great question. And I hope I can do it justice and maybe connect it also to Facundo's question about the minority majority. So one way of thinking about Beck's ethics is that it has several components. One, Jews need to behave better, right? Like you have ethical responsibility. You need to behave ethically in the world. Second, this entails this missionizing idea, which cannot be violent. And third, it's how the treatment of Jews measures ethics in the world. So these are three components. Now, the question of Macht and Kraft, Beck would say, yes, Jews have responsibility to, if you want, behave better. It's not a great expression, but it's the closest I have in this moment. And one way of looking at it is to think about the quote that I ended with Einstein and Beck. He can criticize the extremists because they use Macht, right? So it's not limited because they don't follow what he thinks Judaism should follow. Because of that, so it's Kraft is both a critique of the world, it's also a call to action to behave more morally, but it's also a self-critique for Beck. So you can look at how Jews behave and act in the world and their use of violence and criticize that. So that's kind of how I read this tension between Macht and Kraft. And of course, he did pass away in 1956. He did not write about, let's say, the War of Independence. He visited Israel several times. So I don't know what he would have said about those. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but this is one way of parsing the usefulness of Macht versus Kraft, which I found striking because I think it's a very helpful way. To an extent, it is, we should say, and I alluded to it, also naive. Because do we know of any example of colonialism that doesn't end up with some kind of violence? He thought it's possible. And when I say he thought it's possible in this lecture that I cited after the war, he talks about how it is to take place, right? He's like, we should open those schools that would train Jews in the Jewish Theological Seminary and the Hebrew Union College in the States. And these are the people that would be well-trained and go in the world, kind of. I imagine it as a kind of MA in missionary studies. But so he had concrete ideas, right? It wasn't just abstract, but it remains on the level of abstract because this idea of ethics is somewhat abstract until we get to the everyday action.
Thank you very much.
Hay una pregunta que dejó en el chat Guillermo Atlas. Profesor, si usted puede leerla.
O puedo leerlo en español primero, si quieren.
Dale.
Ok, yo digo que Beck, la defensa del judaísmo, en realidad se expresa en términos de misión ética universal. Eso se puede leer como humanismo o como un eco, ¿no?, de la misión civilizadora imperial. ¿Dónde traza la línea entre un universalismo ético legítimo y la reproducción de un marco civilizador heredado del imperio? Ya, digamos, algo ya mencionó eso, pero me gustaría un poco profundizar ese aspecto.
Thank you. Yes, that's a great question. When I first read his idea about Jewish missionizing, and I realized that it's not, because a lot of Jews, as I mentioned, talked about this ethical monotheism and Jewish mission, but they meant it in very abstract terms. And once I realized he actually talks about missionizing, and I think the evidence I provided is conclusive in this regard, and the great biographer of Beck, Michael Meyer, also agrees with this type of assessment. Then the question becomes really, where's the boundary, right? Or how to draw the line. And I think the only way to understand it is through the historical context, and the historical context both of empire and later of the post-Holocaust era. Now for Beck, I don't think the line is as strong and clear as we would see it today. And the reason for that is because for Beck, it's not involving violence, right? So it's just a different kind of ethic. Does that make sense? So if it's doing good in the world in a different, non-violent way, it's basically one way of thinking about it is leading by example, right? It's Jews go there, Jews live ethically, Jews show the beautifulness of their religion and encourage people to join. Would be something like Beck had in mind, although he never elaborated beyond what I said about the concretes of how this type of settlements or missionary societies would look like. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah. Thank you.
Hay una, Juan Agustín Blasco tiene una pregunta, si quiere desmutearse.
Buenas. Thanks, Professor Feller, for all the explanation on the speech. I'm talking from Spain. I would like to bring another point because Leo Baeck was not only a philosopher or just someone who studied the ideas. He, of course, was the head of the Jewish community in the worst years of the Nazi period, and also was a prominent person, of course, interested in that ghetto. So I would like to bring the point of the critics of Hannah Arendt to the Jewish leaders, not just in the point of the ideas, but the critics it also points the possibility of collaboration with the Nazi power of the Jewish leader, especially in the position of Leo Baeck as a head of the Jewish community in Berlin, but also as a prominent in Theresienstadt, when he finally found, because someone who escaped from Auschwitz, I think it was, came to the Theresienstadt camp and explained what was happening there, and Leo Baeck decided to not say anything to anyone. So I think it will be interesting to talk about this because, of course, as you said in the explanation, Leo Baeck is a very important, but it's good to talk about this. I think the only critics that I ever heard about Leo Baeck. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Juan Agustin. That's a great question, and it would be a completely different talk to just talk about Beck in the Holocaust. About half of my book deals precisely with these questions. So now I can just give kind of bulletin points type of answer. So Hannah Arendt's critique of Beck, just like the critique of the other elders of the ghettos, was that even though whether they meant well or were power hungry, it doesn't really matter, because in the end they contributed to the destruction of the people. That's the critique that Arendt expressed, which was the one that really turned Eichmann in Jerusalem into this huge scandal and caused some of her friends, like Kurt Blumenfeld, like Gershom Scholem, to break ties with her. There's a good work about Beck in the years after 1938. So Arendt herself, in the correspondence with Scholem, distinguishes between the self-help organization between 1933 and 1938 and what happens later. And she's like, until 1938, that's totally fine, right? It's a Jewish self-help organization under very difficult conditions. It changes once it becomes a Gestapo-controlled organization, and it changes again when the deportations begin. Now, Beate Meyer, who is a German historian who did a very thorough work on this period in the leadership of German Jewry, found that Beck was indeed the symbolic head of the organization, but he did not lead the everyday, today decisions. I am not saying that justifies him or not, because I'm not interested in justifying him or not. I'm just kind of setting the historical records. And the German community, we should remember, in response to Arendt, which again is drawing on Beata Meyer, was in a very different situation. By 1938, about 2/3 have left, and most of the people who have left were the people who could afford to leave, right? Which means they were young, which means they were perhaps some of the more well-established families. So it was a very poor, impoverished, struggling, elderly community relatively to some other communities. So this is just something to keep in mind as we think about the historical context. Yes, I think Beck had moments which are controversial. For example, when there was a small communist and small Zionist attempts at resistance, Beck completely was abhorred or very concerned by it, because he knew that as the head of the entire community, he knew that retaliation will come, which it did, right? And the same can be said for Theresienstadt and knowing about what's going on. There the story is more complicated. Beck presented it as if it's something that only he knew. That's not the case. Like, he gets some of the facts mangled up, shall we say. And Anna Chaikova wrote a very good book called The Last Ghetto, which is a history of Theresienstadt. And she kind of details how actually many people knew. But I think it's, regardless of how we evaluate it, it's consistent with Beck's thoughts about optimism. He believed that it would cause despair. And despair is the loss of optimism, and hence the loss of Judaism and ultimately of life. He was like, maybe it's wrong. Maybe some people still survive there. Again, we can disagree with the decision, but my job as a historian and scholar is to figure out where it comes from. And I think it is consistent with the overarching main trajectories of his thinking. One final point on that, if I may. The most interesting part, I think, that people have not talked enough about, except some Beck scholars, and that I have about half a chapter in my book about, is a manuscript Beck wrote of 1,200 pages with two other co-authors, Leopold Lucas and Hilde Ottenheimer. 1,200 pages about the legal positions of the Jews in Europe from antiquity. It was called Until Enlightenment, but it runs until the present day, or until Nazism. And this manuscript is very controversial, both in terms of its content, but also in terms of its emergence history. Because Beck mentioned that he wrote it for the resistance, because there was a German conservative resistance, but there are documents to suggest that it was written at the order of the Gestapo. So that a Gestapo officer who specialized in the legal stuff wanted this type of manuscript, which of course you couldn't quite say no, right? So that forces us a whole different set of questions about intellectual forced labor, which is not unique to Germany or to Beck. You have the Jewish Museum in Prague. You have in Vilna the people who sorted the books, right? Or who wrote works for Nazi scholars. So this is something that existed, and I go kind of in great detail in the book to figure out what this manuscript is. I end up concluding personally that although the manuscript was not written for the resistance, I think the burden of proof is on those who say it was for the resistance. The fact that the text was not written for the resistance does not mean that it is not a text of resistance. So Beck has a lot of moments there where, and the co-authors, where they try to work with the stereotypes or work within the constraints. And I try to find some of those moments. So that's kind of a short-ish answer to a very long and very profound issue. So thank you.
Thanks.
Una, lo digo en español, lo traduce. Una cuestión que me llamó la atención es que no solo aprendí sobre Leo Baeck, sino sobre Claude Montefiore, el dirigente de la comunidad liberal, creo que en Gran Bretaña, ¿no? Sí. Y claro, uno conocía las raíces del antisionismo de izquierda, el Bund, Schomer, Hatzair, Dror, bueno, Hobbes, pero que hay un origen liberal antisionista. El liberalismo antisionista de Claude Montefiore fue para mí una novedad maravillosa. No conocía esa parte de la historia del judaísmo. No, la verdad que desconocía esa punta, ese hilo de una tradición liberal antisionista, ¿no? Salvo, no sé, Vargas Llosa, que es liberal y es antisionista.
Yeah, thank you. And we tend to forget it, of course, because the liberal and reform movement changed, right? Now their position is completely different. One of the largest German Jewish organizations, the Zentralverein, which was an organization to combat anti-Semitism, right? That was the main mission of the organization. It was explicitly anti-Zionist in its emergence. And it makes sense if you think about it, right? If you are a liberal, reform, or just assimilated Jew in the late 19th century, and it's something my students also find very hard to accept. But it is interesting, right? If you are in this position, all you want is to be a good German. And Zionism, for them, from their perspective, stands in contradiction. Now, we can debate whether or not it is a real contradiction. Of course, Zionist thinkers would say they were duped and they were never accepted as Germans, right? That's the myth of the German Jewish symbiosis. But from their perspective, they're like, no, we are good Germans. And that's why it's a Deutsche Bürger mosaischer Glaube, right? It's the German citizens of the Mosaic faith. It was very important that your religion is just one part of your identity, and you can be a good German Jew. And the Zionists seem to be saying to them, no, you can't. So some of them rejected it, and B, some of them were afraid that this would provoke anti-Semitism. So I think I have a quote, I don't have it in front of me, of someone from the Zentralverein, from this major Jewish organization, that says, oh, those two think alike, right? Because both stress Jewish difference. Now, again, we don't have to agree with them. I'm just positioning it as this was a very common position, which is why you see the vote in the Rabbinic Assembly I mentioned, right? 94 out of 97 wanted to condemn Zionism. Why is that? Because it didn't fit with being a good German. And in fact, I think, don't catch me on that, but I believe that's why the Congress was in Basel. It was supposed to be in Munich, and they did not want it in Germany, right? They were like, no, thank you, no, thank you. Go somewhere else, and it ended up in Basel. So it was way more common than it is now. And there have been people who have done all this intellectual work of exposing it. Beck is an interesting case for me, precisely because he wasn't like this. Like Herman Cohen was like this. Rosenzweig was from a different way like this. But Beck is in this middle position, A, because he lives through all these empires in ways that Cohen and Rosenzweig do not, because they pass away earlier, that he has to grapple with changing views. And he comes to see it, I suggest, as one mode of Judaism, as one mode of expansion. It has good things in it. And he takes great pride in when he visits Palestine, later Israel, in some of the German settlements, the Moshavim, the Kibbutzim, that are based on German Jews. He's like, this is amazing. This is like ideal society of German Jews who settled in Palestine. So it's not like he was opposed to it, right? That's important to point out, but there was also a strand in him that didn't just accept it the same way, say, Martin Buber did. So that's the interesting thing in Beck for me in this question, and in people like Montefiore who show the other side of it. So thank you for this comment.
Gracias, querido Yaniv. Puso ánimo. Bueno, yo no dije ánimo, puso ahí ánimo. ¿Hay otras preguntas anotadas, Alejandro? Bueno, yo
No,
comento así como un dato no tan casual que la obra de Leo Baeck se publicó, yo creo, en 1960, en la década del 60, por Paidós. Por lo menos 2 o 3 libros, algún texto sobre la figura histórica de Jesús. La esencia del judaísmo está publicada en español en la década del 60 y todo le cuento a Yaniv, algo que quizás algunos de los amigos que están aquí sepan, que es que lo editó el rabino Marshall Meyer, que fue un rabino muy importante acá, que estuvo en la lucha por los derechos humanos, tuvo un papel muy importante, y que junto con Abraham Heschel era Leo Baeck y Abraham Heschel se publicaron muy tempranamente aquí. Los dos por la editorial, la casa editorial Paidós, en la década del 60 en la Argentina, sí, Heschel y Leo Baeck.
Thank you. I hope I encouraged you all to go and read Leo Baeck now. If I've done that, then my job here is done. Especially that it's
Bueno,
available in Spanish.
como dice Harold Bloom, los malentendidos producen efectos interesantes. Así que la inteligencia artificial va a hacer que esto sea un poco, es como surrealista, un cadáver exquisito. O sea,
Pablo,
sí.
I just want to say, I want to share. I don't know if you know this because I
Ah,
know,
ok.
yeah. I'm translating into Spanish these people, Israel, and also a group of different essays about Judaism and Christianity. And I don't know, that was a couple of years ago, and you can find it in Spanish and just translated. I got the rights. That was a very emotional moment. I had to contact, I don't know how to say in English. Nieta is, how do you say in English? Nieta. Well, I contact to Marianne.
Mariana Dreyfus.
Yeah, exactly. And she just lent me the rights to translate it and to publish in Spanish. Just want to comment that.
Thank you so much. I know translations are a lot of work, and they are often, but they are often a labor of love. So thank you for doing that.
Vamos a publicar la obra de Yaniv. El libro de Yaniv va a ser publicado en español seguramente, pronto. Vamos a ver. Ánimo, como dice la inteligencia artificial. ¿Alguna otra?
Eh,
El
eh, ah,
Shil, la
perdón,
sinagoga Leo
perdón,
Baeck.
Pablo.
Sí.
Anoté una pregunta en inglés, después
Ah,
la puedo hablar en español, pero discúlpame, ¿no?
mala de
Terminar.
Alejandro, por favor. Dale, sí, Guillermo.
Ok, perfecto. Quería preguntar si el concepto este que está utilizando, digamos, respecto al tema del imperio, etcétera, se podría aplicar también al judaísmo británico, francés o al sionismo temprano, donde también hay tensiones entre esa resistencia por un lado, pero apropiación del discurso imperial.
Okay, the artificial intelligence did it very quickly, but I hope I got it. So the question is if the concept can be applied to other type of Judaisms. And the answer is absolutely. In fact, what drew me was that if you think about the canon of Jewish thought, who are the major thinkers? We often think about a lot of German Jews, right? Hermann Cohen, Mendelssohn, Hermann Cohen, Martin Buber, Franz Rosenzweig, I would add Leo Baeck. But there has been a lot of work about what's called Jews and Empire, especially in three empires: in the Austro-Hungarian, in the Russian Empire, and in the Ottoman Empire. And that makes sense because these are the empires with the most Jews. Like literally the most Jews lived in those areas. However, what interested me was the fact that what I call, and I have the theoretical framework in the introduction to my book, what I call Jewish imperial imagination was never applied to Germany. And the reason I think why people didn't talk about it was because they thought of Germany as this nation state, as this homogeneous entity with one language, one religion, no colonies, etc. But if you think, oh, East Prussia was actually Poland, and there were Catholics and Protestants, and they spoke different dialects and were only recently unified, and then as soon as they were unified, they had these colonies, both inland and outside, right? And if you look at how other groups treated Germany, so the conference in which they basically carve out Africa, right, among the colonial powers, it takes place in Berlin. It doesn't take place in London or Paris. So that was a sign for me that I actually need to take the work that has already been done about Jews in the French Empire, Jews in the British Empire, and see what this idea can tell us about Jews in the German Empire, which first requires that we recognize that Germany was an empire. Does that make sense? So yes, there has been a lot of works on Jews in other empires, and I think my theoretical framework on the Jewish imperial imagination, which I didn't really go into here for lack of time, can also be applied back to other Jewish thinkers, whether in other imperial contexts.
Thanks a lot.
A ver, no sé si estoy pensando libremente, ¿no? Hay una tradición, historiográfica que supone que hay una relación no en términos solo de expansión, sino también de vivir bien bajo los imperios. O sea, los judíos han vivido bien bajo los imperios. Por ejemplo, con Francisco José, ¿no? Joseph Roth, hay una larga tradición que los judíos vivieron mejor bajo imperios, por ejemplo, el austrohúngaro, y que en realidad los judíos padecieron con los estados nacionales o con ese tipo de guerras, ¿no? Pero claro, son también se amplía no solo anhelos imperiales inconscientes, sino quizás, o misionero, aunque sea éticas, sino también que los judíos viven bien bajo el imperio, o sea, históricamente.
So my translation disappeared for a moment, so I hope I got the full question and comment, and I'll try to do justice to it. So I think you're absolutely right. I think the issue is that people who write about Jews and empire, they do so as a critique of the nation state, whether it's particular nation states or whether it's Israel as a nation state, right? And what I want to point out is that empires, and it's true, Jews did have at times better lives under empires, or under the empires I mentioned. But what I suggest my research does is, A, it forces us to think about how it influences the philosophy or the thought, the theology, but also that empires are not always that nice, right? Like there's a new or recent history, I believe Caroline Elkins, of the history of the British Empire as a history of violence. And the German Empire is, of course, responsible for what is arguably the first genocide of the 20th century, of the Herero and Nama in Africa, in the German colonies. So it's an important reminder that it's not always as pleasant as the theorists of empire's multiculturalism want us to assume. So my research also, it's not the center of it, but yes, it pushes against this tendency.
Gracias. Toda. ¿Alguna otra pregunta, Alejandro? Bueno,
No.
finalmente una cuestión. Todos en esta conferencia estamos pensando en el mismo tema y no lo decimos. Estamos haciendo comparaciones en nuestra cabeza y no lo decimos. Pero bueno, me parece bien. Hay que ser prudentes. Eh, pero lo voy a hacer a la inversa. ¿Le parece importante, Yaniv, en términos de lo que estamos siendo testigos hoy, que el pensamiento de Leo Baeck puede tener una actualidad en hoy, digamos, en lo que pasa al pensamiento judío, el fanatismo, el antisemitismo, todo, ¿no? Sí, digamos, ¿qué nos dice hoy el pensamiento de Leo Baeck? Si nos puede decir algo.
Yeah, that's a great question. And the historical, I alluded to it when I talked about the Zionism, of course, and the different options and about the ethics. I would say a couple of things really as bulletin points that I think draw on Beck's thought. First, it is to remain Jews, right? That was very clear to Beck, right? That Jewish life, Jewish community, they matter, and that inner Jewish divisions are not as important. So he has this post-war lecture where he says, Judaism is the noun, and what comes before it is the adjective: liberal, reform, Zionist, anti-Zionist, right? It's what we call big tent Judaism. And that was the important part, but also, as said, why Jews in the world? He would say the world needs Jews and Jews needs to be Jews, so that's one thing. The second thing is that ethics, and that's something I did not really touch upon in this lecture, ethics is always tied to action. So you can't just leave ethics in your mind. If you don't do something in the world for the greater good, then it's not ethics. So for him, Judaism is a religion of the deed. It's a religion of doing. And that's his critique of Protestantism, that it's all about your faith, which can lead to disengagement from actual work in the world. So that, I would say, is the second thing. It's not enough to just want the good. For Beck, you have to do the good. Now, what that means in our very contested time, that I think is something we need to figure out given the changing circumstances. But only ethic action places before God. Yes, thank you, Juan Agustin. And if you think about it this way, it's also that there is more than the current moment. I alluded to it again with this Jewish existence of the Jew lecture. Judaism always points to something beyond the current moment. That's what Beck believed, especially under Nazism, but even before and after. And that's also an important reminder, I think, for us as we are swamped by this, bombarded of news, at least here in Florida, but everywhere else in the world, that there is something beyond it that should give us strength and steadfastness. And it's not a lot to work with, but it's something that should give us some kind of hope, which is a concept Beck insisted on. In fact, the last section of this people, his posthumous historical magnum opus that Juan translated to Spanish, the last section, or the last part, is called Hope. And I think, again, that's not a coincidence. Hope is not just a feeling, it can be a moral strength, moral energy, craft in this world. And maybe this is something that Beck reminds us and we can all take with us.
Bueno, un aplauso. Nos quedaríamos horas oyendo y conversando. Gracias, Toda, Hanks, querido Yaniv. Fue un momento muy especial. Se sintió todo muy Amish. Así que gracias. Gracias y a todos. Pasamos un gran momento de mucho aprendizaje.
Muchas gracias a todos. Hamon toda, Yaniv.
Thank you all, and as said, feel free to reach out to me if you have any further questions or would like information, etc.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Good night.
Thank you.